So my name is Matthias Doepke. I'm a professor of economics at Northwestern University. And I'm a macroeconomist, and a macroeconomist who works on family economics. Now that may seem like a strange start because macroeconomics is the part of economics that deals with the largest part, the economy as a whole, and family economics deals with the smallest part, which is families. It's the smallest possible economic unit. So it may seem odd, but in my work I make the point that I think that actually family economics is very important for macroeconomics. And that is because many of the decisions that are taken by families have important central macroeconomic implications. So one example of that would be fertility choices. Clearly for economic growth, an important part of economic growth is population growth. We know that one important distinction between rich and poor countries is that population growth used to be much higher, has slowed down a lot in richer countries, and that is one reason why raising income levels has been possible. So understanding population growth is therefore a central part of understanding the macroeconomy and economic growth. And clearly fertility decisions, so decisions that affect population growth, are taken within families. That is one example. Another example which is very important today is accumulation of human capital. And we now think of accumulation of human capital, so education, also just new ideas, innovation as really the central driver of economic growth. And human capital decisions really start in the family. It starts with education in the family. It starts with schooling decisions which are made by parents in many cases. So all of these things are really linked intimately to the family. And so in the past, family economics and macroeconomics were really separate fields. In my research, I tried to bring them closer together. So one reason I like to work on family economics is that I think it's important questions. But there's a second reason, which is I think also an interesting reason, which I think it actually works extremely well. So family economics is a relatively recent area in economics, was brought in large part by Gary Becker of the University of Chicago. Family economics really just says that we want to apply the same ideas that drive economics overall, namely the idea that incentives drive human behavior. We want to apply this to family decision making. Now, the idea that incentives matter for decision making is a general idea, should apply to many aspects of life. However, there's decisions where the incentives are somewhat harder to characterize because other things also matter for decisions, such as frictions, adjustment costs, information costs, other things get in the way. So how easy it's going to be to understand the role of incentives will depend in large part on how high the stakes are in a particular decision. And so my argument for why family economics actually works really well, much better than much of economics, is that these stakes are really very high. So think of a different decision. Think, for example, of a savings decision. How much money should I save for the future? How much money should I spend right now? This is actually a very important decision for macroeconomics. If you think of monetary policy, for example, monetary policy is about setting interest rates, and it's about people responding to these interest rate changes in terms of their consumption savings decisions. So it's important for the economy as a whole. It just happens it's not a very high stakes decisions for most people. So if you are a typical person, you maybe have a few $1,000s in your savings account. Whether or not the interest rate is a little bit higher or lower doesn't really make that much of a difference to your life. So if you think about the last time you sat down with friends at dinner and talked about how you will react to the latest interest change of the open market committee, you will probably not be able to recall such a discussion because we don't talk about this. The stakes aren't very high. Now compare those decisions to family decisions. The decision, for example, who you're going to marry, this is maybe the most important decision in your life. It is hugely important. It's something we care about a lot. It's something we think about a lot. A decision to have children, whether to have children at all, whether to have one child, a second child, or 3 or 4. These are decisions that will have an impact on your life for the entire life that you're going to have. It's very important decisions, very high stakes decisions, and it's decisions that people spend a lot of time thinking about. And this is why I think that the incentives are very sharp and actually they work very well in understanding what people actually do. So the interest in family economics is both importance for macroeconomic outcomes, but it's really also that I think it's a very successful field for economic research where our way of thinking about behavior actually has a lot of clear and empirically verifiable implications. So I would now like to talk about a current research project I'm doing as an example of this work that links macroeconomics and family economics. One important concern in family economics and in macroeconomics is population growth. Currently, the main concern about population growth in richer countries is actually low population growth. So we have many countries, not so much United States, but most European countries and Japan have currently extremely low fertility rates. So the typical fertility rate is around 1.4 or 1.5 in many countries, meaning that the typical family has less than 2 children. This is going to have very important consequences for future macroeconomic outcomes because low population growth implies fast population aging and therefore a lot of stress on social insurance systems, pension systems and health insurance systems. And it's probably the main fiscal policy challenge that rich countries currently face. So one challenge is to understand why is it that fertility rates are currently so low in many developed countries. Now, one clue that we get is that while fertility is low in many countries, it's actually not all that low in at least some cases. United States is one example where we have fertility rates close to about 2 children per family, which is what it takes to keep the population constant. That's also true in France and in some Scandinavian countries. So maybe we can learn something from comparing the experience of the very low fertility countries to those that have moderately high fertility rates. Now, the particular perspective we take in this research, which is joined with Fabian Kindermann of the University of Bonn, is to look at the impact on fertility of bargaining within the family. So bargaining, what I mean by bargaining is that to have a child, basic biology, turns out you need actually 2 people. You need both a father and a mother, which would suggest that to have a child, some kind of agreement has to be found between these 2 people that they both agree on this wish to have a child. The economic theory of fertility, starting from Gary Becker, has for the most part abstracted from the need for agreement and from the need for bargaining. So the theory is formulated at the level of a household, where the household wants to have a child, without looking at both parents having to agree to this. So we now look at the role of bargaining, and this is helped in particular by the availability of new data that gives us information on the wish to have a child separately for mothers and fathers. This is a data set, a panel data set covering a number of European countries. And what's really special about this data set is that the respondents are asked separately whether the woman or the man currently would like to have another child. So it's a separate decision, a separate question on fertility intentions that we can then compare to outcomes later on. So the first thing we did is simply documenting what's in this data. And when you look at this data, the first thing that jumps out at you is that there's actually a lot of disagreement within couples about having babies. So one way to look at this is to look at the total number of couples where at least one of them wants to have a child, currently would like to have a baby, and ask the question, well, out of this total number of couples where at least one of them wants to have a child, in how many cases does one of them disagree? One spouse says, I'd rather not have a baby right now. That number turns out to be high. So on average, it's about half of couples. If you look at couples who have 1 or 2 children already, which is really the most important case where you look at the marginal, kind of the final child, out of those couples, up to 70% in some countries have disagreement, where only one of the spouses would like to have that other child and the other one would not. So you see there that there's actually a lot of disagreement going on. Another thing you can do is look at who is actually doing the disagreement. So is it the wife or the husband or the woman or the man who's opposed to having this next child? And there's a very interesting finding which starts to hint at some of the underlying questions, which is that we find that in the countries that have relatively high fertility rates, the disagreement is balanced between genders. If you go to France, if you go to Scandinavia, you find that about equal numbers of men and women say they don't want the next child, and the same numbers are in favor of having that next child. If you go to the low fertility countries, which in this data set we're looking at is Germany, Austria, and a number of Eastern European countries, you find that by a wide margin, it is the women who are opposed to having that next child. So in some countries, we have 3 or 4 times as many women being opposed to having another child compared to the men. So there's a lopsided distribution where it's really the disagreement on the side of the potential mothers that leads to low fertility. So that's just an empirical fact which we would like to then understand. Another thing we can do with the data set is to empirically examine what the impact is of disagreement on the fertility outcome. One possibility would be that they disagree, but maybe it doesn't really matter because in the end, either the husband decides, the wife decides, somehow it's not very important. But if you look at the data, you actually do find that disagreement is very important. So we can then trace those same couples and check a few years later if they actually had that child they were talking about. And what you find is that the probability of having a child is high only if both spouses agree. So if both agree, if they report in the first wave of the survey that they want a child, there's a very high probability of ending up with a child. If only one of them wants to have a child, the probability is actually almost as low as it would be if they both disagreed. If, in particular, if you have the husband saying he wants the child and the wife being opposed to this, nothing's going to happen. The husband alone cannot really affect the likelihood of having a child. If the wife wants to have the child and the husband does not, there's some probability of having a child, but it's still much lower compared to the case where you agree. So it does have a very large impact on the actual fertility outcome, which suggests that this large amount of disagreement in the low fertility countries, especially on the side of the mothers, is actually an important reason for low fertility. So now, of course, you want to understand why is it that in some countries so many women disagree with having another child, leading to low fertility. And what the data suggests is something that I think in the discussion has also been brought up before, but it's now much more clearly visible, which is the idea that the reason for disagreement really is a lopsided distribution of the burden of childcare. So whenever you have a child, you have to make some decision of who is going to take care of this child. Are we going to share the burden? Is there going to be public childcare? Who is going to pay the time cost? Who's going to put in the effort of raising this child? What we find is that the countries where it is the women who disagree with having more children, in those same countries we find that women do the vast majority of childcare. They do 3 or 4 times as much time on raising children compared to men, compared to a much more even distribution of childcare in the places where we have more agreement between the spouses. So in France, in Scandinavia, we find that the women, that fathers do about 40% of the work, still less than half, but a sizable fraction, whereas in the lowest fertility countries, it's sometimes less than 20%. So which suggests that it's really disagreement about who will take care of children that leads women to say, I don't want to have this child, and then explains low fertility. So these are the empirical facts that drive the research, and then there's also theoretical modeling that looks at the limited commitment model to understand those facts, ultimately leading us to a point where we can do some policy analysis. We can then ask how can you change, maybe through provision of public childcare, other interventions, the division of the burden of childcare and thereby affect the fertility rate. A second area of my current research I would like to talk about is research on the economics of parenting. And this is work joined with Fabrizio Zilibotti of the University of Zurich. So what I mean by parenting is choices in parenting that go beyond basic decisions like how many children I want to have or whether children go to school. It goes to questions such as time use. How much time do I spend with my children? Do I want to play with them a lot of time? Do I read stories to them? Also, what kind of parenting style do I want to have? Do I want to be a very strict authoritarian parent? Do I want to be very warm and emotionally close? Or maybe more distant and just have the children being taken care of by someone else. These questions we now understand are important questions because research in recent years has shown that parenting and outcomes in the family in the very early years are actually very important for success in life. So Jim Heckman has done a lot of work on this, and many other researchers too, showing that much of what happens to the family before children even enter elementary school has a very large impact on future outcomes. So we see there's a lot of decisions being made very early on, parenting decisions that are important to understand if you want to understand, for example, economic growth, human capital accumulation, and also socioeconomic inequality, because there's a lot of differences in parenting across different groups in the population. So we see these decisions are important. Another thing we see is they have changed a lot. So for people my age, one of the interesting observations is that the way we grew up as children 30, 40 years ago is very different from the way we raise our children nowadays. My recollections from childhood are a time where children were mostly on their own. We didn't see our parents that much. We would go on our own to our friends to play soccer outside, come back for dinner. There wasn't really a whole lot of intensive attention being paid to children. There was a lot of independence. Nowadays, we have these new phenomena of helicopter parenting, where parents are always around, always drive their children to different activities, pay very close attention to what they do, sign them up for many activities, a very different kind of childhood compared to what many of us experienced just a few decades ago. These same differences we observe in changes over time, so a few decades ago compared to nowadays. We also observe across countries. So for example, if we look at parenting choices in the United States compared to European countries, we actually do find some European countries where parenting looks a lot like we remember from our own childhood. In Scandinavia, for example, Sweden is still a place where children have a lot of room for themselves. There is a much less of an academic focus in early education. So there's no reading or writing in preschool. Elementary schools such as age 7, so it's a more relaxed entry into childhood, and everything somehow seems to be a bit more relaxed compared to the way we do things here. So in our research, we use these same economic theories we use for other parts of economics, the idea that incentives matter for decision making, to understand the changes in parenting and the difference in parenting across countries. So a key idea of this research is that what matters for parenting is how high the stakes are in what you do as a parent early on. And so part of the stakes come from your expectations of what your children's life will be like in the future. So ultimately, we believe, and we think it's right, that parents are motivated by altruism. They want to do well for their children. They want their children to succeed. The question that parents ask themselves is, what does it take for the child to succeed, and how high are the stakes in doing something wrong? So our argument why nowadays parenting seems so much more intensive, that there's so much more anxiety and so much more effort being put into raising these children, is that the stakes indeed have gone up a lot. So one big difference in the economic environment between the 70s and nowadays is that inequality has gone up a lot. Returns to education have gone up a lot. So I grew up in Germany, which is still a low inequality country, but we have similar trends there. But when I was a child in Germany, the stakes, for example, in education and doing well in school weren't really all that high. Inequality was very low. So if you went out of school at age 15 or 16 and became a factory worker at the VW local plant, your income would be very much similar to somebody who went then to high school, university, and became a doctor or lawyer later on. There was, of course, some difference, but in relative terms, those differences were very small. Unemployment was low, so the probability of your child not getting any job was really something that people didn't really have to consider. Even if your child finished high school, even then it didn't really matter how well you did, because there was open admission to universities. The university were all the same. So whether you finished with a GPA of a 4.0 or 2.1 and just scrape by, doesn't really make a difference. And so the stakes were much lower, and so it really makes sense for parents to say, well, I'm not going to get overly worried about my child's performance in school, for example, and just let them have an easy, relaxed childhood. Compared to that, we now see that the stakes have risen a lot. So we now see that the economic outcomes between people who go to college and who only finish high school or don't even finish high school, the gap has gone much wider in terms of earnings, but also in terms of risks of unemployment and many other outcomes that parents might be worried about. So the anxiety that parents have about the children doing well in school, there's some reason this has changed, that inequality has gone up a lot. And the same difference in the size of stakes that we observed between the 70s in the United States and nowadays in the United States, the same difference we can observe across countries. So the countries I've mentioned earlier, where nowadays parenting still seems more relaxed, places like Sweden are the places where we have much lower inequality, and so there are, in a sense, lower stakes in parenting. So in our research, we apply economic theory, the idea that incentives drive economic behavior, to understand parenting choices. And at this stage, it's really about understanding what parents do. Of course, down the road, the direction of the research is also to work out policy implications. An important concern about parenting nowadays is inequality in parenting, in the sense that we see a lot of persistence in social status across generations, and part of this has to do with parenting. One particular challenge that we know is quite important here is that, of course, being a very intensive parent is harder if you're a single parent, and being a single parent is much more common if you are kind of less fortunate in terms of your background, in terms of education or income. So ultimately, we have to think about solutions, how we can close some of those gaps in parenting, and of course, understanding the economics of parenting is an important part of that. So to summarize, I'm a macroeconomist working on family economics. This brings two very different fields together. I think what is really exciting about these times in research is that family economics is becoming a much more integral part of economics as a whole. This is one example of that, but there's other examples. Certainly family economics now is very essential to the economics of education and also to labor economics. When family economics started out with Gary Becker 20, 30, 40 years ago, for some time it was more of a specialty field, some particular application to use economics to understand fertility, marriage, some things people thought were mostly orthogonal, independent of other things we care about in economics. I think nowadays we understand that the family plays an essential role for most things we really care about in economics. And in research now we really bring those fields more together and get new and exciting results for that.